Hey there, welcome to GraphQL Radio, the GraphQL podcast. We haven't seen you guys in a long time because we've been cooking some great things in our studio. Today I am joined by Nikolas Burk from GraphQL. Welcome, Nikolas.
Hey guys, hey Abby. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, no problem. So while we were away, Nikolas has been really championing this new project called How to GraphQL that has now over 1,000 stars on GitHub and sat at the top of Product Hunt on launch day, which was like 2 weeks ago. We wanted to get Nikolas on the show to pretty much describe the whole process of how to GraphQL and how our listeners can get involved. Nick, what is how to GraphQL?
All right, so How to GraphQL is basically a full-stack tutorial website that we want to be the entry point for all developers that are interested in learning about GraphQL. Like, what we actually realized in our content efforts here at GraphQL and in actually educating people about what GraphQL is that most of the developers still have a hard time really understanding what GraphQL is and where it fits into their technology stack. So we kind of wanted to clean up a couple of confusions and misconceptions that developers have around GraphQL, and really wanted to make it clear that GraphQL is a technology that can and probably should be used by everybody who is using an API. So this was kind of the goal for the whole project, and we kind of wanted to do that with a very thorough introduction where we start basically at nothing, so we don't assume any prior knowledge about GraphQL. Basically, all the knowledge that we assume people to have when they come onto the site is that they have a rough understanding of what an API is and how client-server communication works in general. But this is really all we require, and then you can just get into the content that we provide.
Yeah, definitely, and the site looks beautiful, by the way.
Yeah, we have a great designer.
Yeah, really, right?
He's awesome.
Before we get too much into the nitty-gritty, Nick, could you explain what you do at GraphQL on a daily?
For sure. So I joined GraphQL in January, so roughly half a year ago. And I kind of took over the content that we are producing here. So I was actually working as an instructor for app development in San Francisco before that. And I always really enjoyed teaching and learning and sharing my knowledge. So this was kind of the reason why the GraphQL team brought me on and had me join their company. Since then, I've been doing a lot of stuff here. So I actually also worked a little bit on our front end. But my day-to-day work mostly consists of writing tutorials, writing articles, blog posts, and making sure that we're educating people about what we're doing and about the technologies that we're using.
Nice.
So it's really cool because my main workflow essentially consists of that I have to go and learn something new, and then I have to make sure that I'm able to explain it in a way that other people who didn't yet understand this will go and be able to understand it. So it's awesome. A very nice circle of learning and then being able to share that newly acquired knowledge.
That's great. So I would say that you're pretty experienced in instructing people on GraphQL thus far, having done all the tutorials that I've seen for GraphQL, as well as just being a really thoughtful person in the community answering questions. What do you think is this big gripe that people have with learning GraphQL? And, which is the reason why we built these tutorials in the first place. What is the biggest hiccup?
So one big issue, I think, is that, or actually I think two really common misconfusions. The first one, I think, is related to the suffix of GraphQL, the QL, this query language thing, which people only know from databases. So it's kind of natural that when they hear GraphQL, they think about databases and not about API. And this is the biggest misconfusion that we have to clean up with, and where we have to tell people, no, this is not a database technology. This is an API technology. So that's kind of the first big misconception here. And then the second one, which is also slowly getting better, but is that most developers will think that GraphQL is only relevant in the JavaScript space, and maybe only for front-end developers that are using React, for example. And this is also a very, very common misconception, which kind of came about through Facebook always talking about GraphQL in the context of JavaScript and React. I mean, the first time that Facebook actually introduced GraphQL was at a React conference. So it's very natural for people to think that this is kind of a technology that can only be used with React. But this is, of course, not true at all either. So that's kind of the second big point where we have to tell people, no, this is for everybody. You can use it wherever an API is required to make a client-server communication more efficient and make life easier for front-end developers, be it if they use like React, Angular, Vue.js, Ember, or even like native mobile development platforms. So it's really not about this particular one React technology, but instead like for all technologies and languages.
Yeah. I remember when I was starting to evangelize GraphQL in my circles, I would probably tell everybody that it makes front-end developers' lives easier, but as a server engineer, your life doesn't change that much, you know? Mm-hmm. And over time, as we've started to realize that GraphQL is for clients, not necessarily front-end developers, it's for clients. That mm-hmm. even a server talking to a GraphQL server, server-to-server communication,
right?
It's still someone is the front-end developer in that situation, right? And so that's the thing, is another big miscommunication is GraphQL is only for front-end UI developers, you know? And that's not the case, especially with, you know, a GraphQL project called GraphQL Request, which allows you to make GraphQL requests from, you know, anywhere, server, whatever.
Okay. Yep. Which is just like a like small and lightweight wrapper around JavaScript fetch, essentially, for those people who don't know what GraphQL request is.
Exactly, yeah. But so I would like to touch on this misconception of it's only for JavaScript. And you're right, you know, they announced it at a Facebook conference. GraphQL.js is totally the most popular of the GraphQL implementations. But as we've seen with How to GraphQL, there actually exists a lot more to offer on the server side for GraphQL. Could we get into like how we, you know, came about with all these different tutorials for the other implementation?
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I think that's really important to understand when we're talking about GraphQL in the first place is that GraphQL itself really is only a specification. So GraphQL itself is not code, but it's actually just a document that describes behavior of a GraphQL server and how a GraphQL server needs to behave when it receives a certain request. So this is all that GraphQL is. So as GraphQL is only this kind of description, you can take any programming language of your choice to build the GraphQL server that implements the specification. So that's also really important to understand, that you can build a GraphQL server with any server or with any programming language, essentially, that you can write servers with. So that's a really important point to understand. And when we built or when we started building How to GraphQL, we didn't want to limit the space of the whole tutorial to only JavaScript, as there are so much more programming communities that we wanted to include in that project and that we wanted to make familiar with a new way how you can design APIs. And so we kind of reached out to the community, as there are a lot of reference implementation and various lots of reference implementations in various languages already. So we kind of reached out to leading people from these communities and asked them if they were willing to contribute tutorials. And we were able to just gather an amazing team of contributors who worked really, really hard, especially towards the launch in the end, and who got all the content ready. So I'm really, really happy how it worked out in the end. And we don't want to stop there. So if some of the listeners have like a programming language of their choice that they don't see on the How to GraphQL website yet, they're more than welcome to reach out and to go ahead and write that tutorial themselves.
Yeah. So for all you server engineers out there, How to GraphQL currently has tutorials for GraphQL.js, GraphQL Elixir, GraphQL Ruby, and GraphQL Java, with 2 more coming soon, which is Graphene, which is a Python implementation, and Sangria, which is Scala, I believe.
Exactly.
So I just listed out 3 that are active on How to GraphQL that I didn't even know existed. So it's totally true that the misconception is it's only JavaScript. I didn't even know there was one for Elixir for that. So I would say props to GraphQL team to finding those people that are working on those diligently to give a tutorial back.
What I'm personally really curious about, as like having a background in native development, is the first tutorial that's written in Swift for the server side. So like a Swift GraphQL server tutorial, this would be like really, really awesome. So if we have someone among the listeners would be willing to contribute that, that would be really exciting, I think.
So let's get into the specifics of how to GraphQL. We're going to do something different on this show that we haven't done before. We're going to share, Nick's going to share his screen and walk us through the different parts of how to GraphQL. I believe there are a lot of fundamentals plus front end and back end. And I love for the viewers to kind of get a tour from Nick himself.
All right. Yeah, very cool. So I'll start sharing my screen here. Okay, so I'll try to make this not too dependent on the actual video, as I think we have a lot of listeners who are going to listen to this like on their commute who don't have the video. So I'll try to explain everything what I see as well. But for those who are watching the video, this might be a bit more instructive.
Yep.
So the whole idea of how to GraphQL is to provide like first a kind of theoretical introduction into GraphQL, and then we branch out into practical tutorials. And so the way how the whole site is structured is essentially in three big parts. The first part is this theoretical GraphQL part, which is split again into GraphQL fundamentals and advanced GraphQL. And we kind of see this advanced GraphQL part as optional, as like you need some minimum requirements, some minimal understanding of GraphQL that you can get through the GraphQL fundamentals to actually move on with the practical tutorials. So we do recommend that if you haven't heard of GraphQL before and you're very eager to actually start building something, that you still first go through these 4 fundamental chapters, which we have right here. Then, once you're done with the fundamentals, you can either choose to go or to dive a bit deeper into some advanced topics with this advanced GraphQL part here. And once you're done with that, or if you already want to get your hands dirty after the fundamentals, you can pick your hands-on tutorial that you want to do. And for the hands-on tutorials, we've got 2 major like categories as well. One is for the front end, and the other one is for the back end. And here we really want to make sure that when you're dealing with one or the other, so in the front end, that you're only focusing on the relevant like concepts that are important for front-end development. Then on the other hand, like when you're doing the back-end development or the back-end tutorial, you don't want to like think about how this would now work on the front-end side. So you really try to target front-end developers and back-end developers and not to mix up concepts too much here. So here is a list of all the tutorials which you can choose from on the front end and on the back end side. But I'd say that we first go through the 3 different parts that I have just mentioned now and take a look at the content a little bit. Unless you might have any questions so far. But
I just want to point out that how to GraphQL is designed to be like a track, like a railroad track, and
yes,
you start at the beginning of the track, and you pretty much go your way through all of it, and at the end we hope, and we really hope, that you become a well-rounded GraphQL developer, and you can get off and get on at any stop. So that's kind of how the site is designed, and the content really flows there. Another thing I'd like to mention about the content, which we're about to see, a lot of people don't like watching videos, but they like reading content, and Nikolas did a great job of supplying screencasts as well as complementary content, like written content for the chapters. So Nick, take it away.
All right. Yeah. So this point about the track is actually really, really good here, as like the whole thing is just like an individual learning path for the reader. So you can choose the parts that you actually want to learn from. All right. So let's head into the GraphQL fundamentals part. So here we start with an introduction, and in the introduction, we kind of cover like the main idea of GraphQL and like try to provide an understanding for people who really just know what an API is and try to start exactly from that point. So you know what an API is. So now we are going to explain to you how GraphQL fits into your perspective of this API concept that you've been working with in the past. So here, in the very beginning, we want to make it clear that this is not a database language, but it's a query language for APIs. And I think that this is really a key phrase, which already hopefully triggers like the click for the people to have like a little bit more context as to what is going to come. Then we have like a quick comparison with REST APIs, where it's mainly about like the context, the historic context in which REST APIs were developed. And here we kind of claim there are three factors that have been driving the evolution of APIs and how GraphQL came about. And that is like increased mobile usage that was happening from mobile networks. This really created the need for Facebook back then, when they started working on GraphQL, to have a more efficient way for client-server communication. Then the second big factor that was driving this is the variety of different front-end frameworks and platforms. So today we not only have web applications that are accessing a server, but we also have mobile applications. And they are going to have largely different requirements. And then maybe for the web application, we also have like different versions depending on if you're accessing it from a desktop or from your mobile phone as well. So all these different client applications will have like slightly different requirements. And if you're using a REST API there, then like the static nature of REST APIs will make it very difficult for you to make sure that all these different clients get exactly the data that they need. And that's just a great use case for GraphQL. And then the third factor is this fast development and the expectation for rapid feature development. So we're not in like the 1990s anymore, where software was actually deployed on CDs or floppy disks or something like this, and then you would go to a store and buy it there. But we have come to a time where software is deployed continuously. Like it's really a standard that you're pushing or deploying your software multiple times a day. And this also creates a need for more flexibility in general. And this is also why REST APIs, we have a hard time making sure that this speed is actually there. We also talked briefly about like the history and the context of GraphQL and explain like how Facebook came around with the idea and how they development. And then in this introduction, we also quickly mention the GraphQL community right here, which consists of a lot of companies that are already using GraphQL in production, but then also like the different resources which you find, the conferences that we have, like GraphQL Summit, which is coming up, GraphQL Europe, which is going to happen again next year. And then, of course, the GraphQL Radio podcast and the GraphQL weekly newsletter as like the main resources that you should be aware of when you want to know what's going on in the GraphQL community and ecosystem.
That's awesome.
All right, any questions about this introduction chapter right here?
I think the introduction here that we've laid out really demystifies a lot of things that people get hung up with on GraphQL. So hopefully that helps demystify it for sure.
Cool. All right. So in the second chapter, which is called GraphQL is the better REST, and admittedly, this is kind of a clickbaity title, but we just chose to go with it at the end. And I think we do have good reasons why this is actually the case. So in this chapter, we're mainly talking about like the technical differences between GraphQL and REST, and talk about one example scenario and think about how we would solve this with a REST API and how we would solve this with GraphQL. And we just kind of realize that this scenario is going to be much easier and much more efficient when using GraphQL. And this is mainly due to the problems of overfetching and underfetching right here. But here I actually want to add a little bit of a grain of salt, actually, because like, this is the classical argument that you put or you tell your REST developers that with GraphQL you can now exactly get the data. You can now get exactly the data that you need from the API instead of having to make multiple requests to get the required data. But admittedly, like with REST, there are approaches how you can get similar benefits. So if you look at Swagger, for example, which is a tool that you essentially put on top of a REST API, you can get many of the same benefits that you have with GraphQL. However, I would still argue that in general, GraphQL is just a better abstraction for client-server communication. So the fact that you have to put a tool on top of a REST API in order to like get the benefits you want from the REST API, which is powering or which is the powering technology you choose for your API. Like that fact means that you kind of chose the wrong abstraction. You chose the wrong abstraction in the first place, and now you have to put a shell around it to make it work. Why not pick the technology that is inherently capable to solve your problems and then use that technology? Of course, GraphQL comes with its own challenges. Like it's still a relatively new technology, and there is still a lot more like things that need to be explored and need to be solved with GraphQL. But I would just argue that GraphQL just is the better abstraction for client-server communication.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah, so one thing I really like to point out here is that so it's usually funny when I'm talking to my non-technical friends and I'm trying to explain them what my job is and what GraphQL is, then it's usually like hard for them to understand what the great thing about GraphQL is, because like I explained to them, with GraphQL, an app can now request exactly the data that it needs from a backend. And when I say that, they kind of look at me and don't understand why this is so revolutionary, because like they usually reply, of course, how else would it be? Why wouldn't you choose, or why wouldn't you just get the data that you need from the server? Like, of course, it's the way how it's supposed to be. So this usually is a bit of like a funny explanation when I have to tell my non-technical friends.
I think one thing to mention about the REST versus GraphQL thing, which we did a good job in this this section, but you know, if people are doing real REST, like true purist REST, then these tools that you put on top of it, such as Swagger and stuff, are still irrelevant in comparison to GraphQL, right? I think one of the biggest things that REST people ask is like, how do you solve the multi round trip problem? And GraphQL does that pretty well. But one thing that's missing is the 20 plus years of tooling and platforms as a service, such as New Relic and all these Datadog and all that stuff that are instrumenting REST APIs because they're resources. How do you instrument one endpoint, right? That has many APIs in it. And you know what? We'll probably write a tutorial about that too, because there are ways to do that, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Shall we go to the last section?
Yeah, so actually, like we've got two more in the GraphQL fundamentals. So we've got the core concepts, and here one thing that we did is actually let me first explain what this whole chapter is about. So in the core concepts chapter, we're going to explain like the core language constructs of GraphQL. So here, it's the first time where we officially introduce like the schema definition language. We explain what a query is, what a mutation is. So like all this theoretical stuff that you need to start out. So we have kind of shifted from before, where we only talked about the context of where GraphQL can be used, into more concrete like constructs of the language itself. And one thing we did right here on the site when you are reading this chapter is that a couple of code snippets have this run in sandbox button right here. And if you click this button, then we are going to generate a working GraphQL server for you in the background that you can then use to fire off the queries that you see in the code snippets. So we actually have like a GraphQL server that is populated with a bit of initial data right here. So we've got the person and the post type, and you can actually go ahead and send queries and see all the data that is currently stored in your sandbox environment. And you can also go and send mutations and everything. But this was really important to us, that when people would get in touch with these fundamental concepts, that they would have a way to try these out directly. And the cool thing is, you can even go ahead and like change the queries right here, because your sandbox is interactive. So you can really do what you like. You can ask for all the persons you currently have stored in the database and all the posts with the author ID and maybe the title, I guess, here. And you can send off that query and you'll get all that information. And here you already see directly how GraphQL actually works. So this part was really, really important to us, to give people the way to try it out directly when they're reading about this.
It's such a game changer too. Like, these interactive examples really demonstrate how powerful GraphQL is, because we rendered it in a sandbox and it works, right? It's amazing.
Yeah. All right. So here we talk about like a couple of different concepts that I won't go in detail right now. So we talk about like queries, mutations, GraphQL subscriptions, which you use for real-time updates, and how you can define your GraphQL schema essentially, so that all of these queries and mutations that we've seen beforehand are actually possible, and you can actually send them. All right, so then the last chapter, or the last part here in the GraphQL fundamentals, is the big picture and architecture chapter. And this really is a chapter where we're picking up the context again, but we are taking one step back essentially and trying to get the broader perspective on GraphQL, how it can be used. And it's kind of divided into three major parts, which each reflect one specific use case of GraphQL. And the first use case would be just like a very, very simple application architecture, where you would have one server with one database, and that server just exposes a GraphQL API. So that's kind of like the greenfield setup that you would start out with in most applications that you're building. You've got one server, and that server just has a GraphQL API instead of a REST API for now. Then kind of the second extreme compared to, like, here we've got the greenfield project where you're starting out, you only have one server, one database. Then you can also use GraphQL as essentially a gateway for multiple existing systems, such as like microservices or third-party APIs. And this is actually like a really, really interesting use case of GraphQL that I think hasn't been explored enough yet. And this really is like the big chance for bigger companies and enterprises that like have legacy systems that have grown over the past maybe 10, 20 years and that nobody can maintain anymore. These companies also have the pressure to like build new and innovative products, but with these kinds of legacy systems, they have a really hard time developing an application that can gather all the required data from the different systems. As like potentially these new applications that the companies want to build, they would have to access multiple systems, so it gets very hard for them to acquire the data that they need. So what you can do is you put like a GraphQL API in front of all these different systems, so that the client APIs only have to talk to this one GraphQL API. They can get all the benefits that you get from GraphQL in the first place, and the life for the front-end developers gets really, really easy. And then the work that you have to do is you have to like just write your resolvers for the GraphQL API to access all these existing systems and fetch the data from there. So kind of hide the complexity of all these different systems and the fragmentation that you have in the backend. You hide all that complexity behind a very nice GraphQL API. And this is a really cool use case of GraphQL that we're also teasing here.
Yep.
And then like the third use case is kind of the hybrid approach of the two, where like the foundation for your application still is one backend with one database, but this GraphQL API that you're using to access the data from the database maybe also integrates existing systems or microservices, or also talks to third-party APIs. So kind of this idea to have your standard server setup with one server and the connect database, but now the same GraphQL API that is just like exposing the data from the database is now also able to incorporate the services from the third-party APIs or microservices or any kind of legacy systems. So these are kind of the three major use cases that we're covering in this chapter.
Wow. Dang, so fundamentals really go really deep into what you should know. If you start on that track and you make it to the end, I'm pretty sure you're ready to go to build anything in GraphQL, because you laid down the context, the history, the use cases, and now architecture. There's no reason why anybody shouldn't be able to write a GraphQL server or any APIs with it either.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
So let's transition more into the how to GraphQL. Like in terms of, this was a big project and you were the lead. And I know because I know you. And it must have been stressful. All these people, all the coordination, everything. Could you speak to how the community kind of came together and helped on this?
Yeah, sure. So essentially what we did is that we are already fairly well connected in the GraphQL community, I want to say. So this made our job a little bit easier in the first place, that we usually knew people from the different communities that either would be candidates to like write the tutorials, to write the tutorials themselves, or to introduce us to someone who will be able to do so. And the process which we had was actually kind of, it wasn't too structured, I want to say. We just kind of tried to find people who would be the right people to contribute a certain tutorial. And once we had a person on board, like either we talked to them through Twitter or by email or something like this, but as soon as we had like their commitment to actually do the tutorial, we would invite them to our dedicated Slack team that we have for the How to GraphQL contributors, where we do all the organization that is needed, and also the How to GraphQL GitHub organization, which we also create specifically for this whole project. And then what I would do is just like, I would create the initial repository for them. So let's take the GraphQL JS track as an example, where we had a really nice contributor. So shout out to Myra, who contributed this tutorial and who was always very much on time with everything that I had asked for. So she was the best kind of contributor that I could have imagined there. And in the beginning, what I would do is I would invite the contributor to the How to GraphQL GitHub organization, create their repository for them. So here, the GraphQL JS repository for Myra. And then she would get all the rights to push to that repository, and she could go from there. I had laid out a couple of like writing guidelines for how you should be writing your tutorial, so that we have all the tutorials in consistent style. And we also have like a couple of special formatting options that we introduce for the tutorials to make sure that everybody would be able to follow. So these are really step-by-step tutorials where it's important that you don't miss an instruction, because if you do miss an instruction, it's very easy to get lost, and you don't really understand why the code that you've been writing so far doesn't work anymore. So what we did, we introduced this special highlighting for instruction blocks, where it would be really clear for people when they would actually have to go and change something in their code. So here, let's take this chapter in the React Apollo tutorial as an example. So here I'm in the queries chapter of the React Apollo tutorial right now, for those of you who can't see the video. And here we have this instruction block that is marked with a blue dot and a blue line on the left side. So everywhere in the tutorial where you see this blue dot and the blue line and the written part is blue as well, this means that you have to do something to actually move forward with the tutorial. And we also realized that a lot of people actually had difficulties to understand where they had to put the code. So we would say in the instruction, create a new file called link.js in the components directory and add the following code. But then the people could get confused where exactly in the tutorial they should put the code. So what we did as well is we link from each code block to the corresponding GitHub file so that people see what the final outcome is in the end. They know where they have to put the code block that they have to put in next.
Yeah, this is like such a really well-polished tutorial with pretty much all the right cues for new engineers that are wanting to get into GraphQL, and even experienced folk too. This kind of just steps the game up on the kind of online tutorials. I don't think I've seen anything like this from other communities, Egghead, things like that. So I'm really excited, and it was really exciting to just see how the GraphQL community steps up once again to kind of give this free resource to everybody. I think all of the people involved were banking on the fact that the more people we get involved into the community, the better our tools become and the better the ecosystem becomes. So for all the implementations, authors that implemented stuff, and for all the people that wrote and did screencasts, it was all based on that investment to get people into the community so we can become a better community. My last question for the day is, where are we going next with How to GraphQL?
Right. So what's next for How to GraphQL? So we certainly don't want to stop here. We have all these tutorials that are currently already in the making. So we are kind of planning to release the next batch of tutorials at the end of August, probably. So that's kind of the timeline that we have set with all current contributors at the moment. And I can't exactly say which tutorials are going to come, but we'll have at least 2 to 3 tutorials that are going to be ready until then. So it's really important to understand that this is like a community project, and we do want the community to get involved. So if you have got ideas as to how this whole site could be improved, it's also open source, so you're also more than welcome to just go ahead and create a PR. But if you have got ideas on how this whole site could be improved, what else we could do different, then feel free to reach out to me and we can discuss the ideas. If you want to contribute some content yourself, then you're also more than welcome to do so. So we really want to make this the long-term resource that will be there as an entry point for developers who are curious to learn GraphQL.
All right, so that was a pretty in-depth explanation of How to GraphQL. I hope the listeners enjoyed that. I think that's all the time we have today. Let's get into some picks. Let's start with Nick, obviously.
All right, so I have 2 picks. The first one is Graph CMS, which is a content management system, a headless content management system that is based on GraphQL. And actually today is their launch day. So they launched today on Product Hunt, and it's a really exciting project. I've actually met one of the founders personally at the last GraphQL Berlin meetup, and they are super nice and have a great product. So I'm really, really curious to see where they're headed as a company and with their product.
Yeah.
And the second pick is GraphQL config and the GraphQL CLI. So that's a project that we have been working on at GraphQL, but also with like a lot of other contributors from the community, with the team at Facebook and at Apollo, where we just wanted to figure out a unified standard for GraphQL configuration files that all the different tools that would be used for GraphQL would understand. So That's the GraphQL config, and the GraphQL CLI is just like a command line tool that will help you with a lot of common tasks all around GraphQL in your projects.
Awesome. Great. Thanks for those picks. I have 2 picks today too. First pick is, I obviously always say stuff about Apollo. So right now, the Apollo, we're tracking for a 2.0 release later this year. And a big part of that is this new store API design. And so that is going on right now, and an intern is heading up that, Shadaj. So props to you, man. As well, I'd like to talk to Evans, who's doing Apollo Link and Apollo Fetch. So a lot of these different libraries that are going to be coming out for Apollo, we'll link those in the show notes. But that's kind of the future of the library, which is like a bunch of composable little libraries, which is really nice.
Yeah, that's
and then my second pick is for just how to GraphQL in itself. Nice. I just want to keep highlighting that new content is coming out. The React Apollo one I heard is really good because Nick wrote it and I did the screencast. So
good team, of course.
It's a good team on that one. So I definitely think everyone should look at that. One last surprise for the listeners. So Johannes couldn't be here today because he has to actually become a CEO now and manage GraphQL. So we're gonna have Nick be a new co-host for the show when Johannes can't join us. Because big CEOs got to do big things. Just
he's
kidding.
Pretty busy right now, so I hope that I can take over and take his place.
Yeah, we just saw that Nick is becoming a really helpful person in the community, and a face of a lot of the tutorials and stuff. That his voice should be heard on the show. And now that we have another co-host, I'm sure we'll have all 3 of us on the show potentially. But I just wanted to say thanks for joining us today. And I can't wait to work with you for future shows.
Yeah, all right. I'm really excited about this, actually. And so to close off, I really want to give a big shout out to all the How to GraphQL contributors. So thank you very much for all your help. And I'm looking forward to working together with everyone in the future.
Awesome. All right, guys. We'll see you next time on How to GraphQL.